oh my God, I'm so exhausted. Just it like, that would definitely, that obviously be a dysfunction with the adrenals occurring. There'd be a beginning to walk on eggshells. And that person is going, fuck, I better start turning my lifestyle around now. And everyone, the best thing about the rebuild process when you start bringing your adrenals and your endocrine system back on track, and I talk about this a lot with those adrenal herbs and those Jing herbs. Yeah, the treatment's awesome and the herbs are awesome, but the best thing is you start feeling your edges because your kidneys and adrenals are associated with your hearing. You start to be able to hear if you start walking on eggshells with your energy, and you become susceptible to something. You stay in too much of a chronic stress state, there's something cracking and then something really going wrong with your endocrine system. And so basically, we want to make sure that if you're hearing those crunches under your feet, you want to start getting onto it now, because the other side of what happens is actual exhaustion. Do you want to go into that, Dan?
Yeah, definitely. These are the sort of the folks that if they keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and their body's ability to secrete and utilize cortisol becomes diminished, then we end up with a scenario where the inflammatory process in the body can no longer be checked. So cortisol is definitely useful. People hear cortisol and they're like, it's a stress hormone. Don't want that. That's evil. It's like, no. You need cortisol. You need to be able to use cortisol. You don't want excess cortisol and you don't want diminished cortisol. You want healthy levels like pretty much every hormone. Where I was going with that is if you can no longer produce cortisol in the amounts required to be utilized to check inflammation, so cortisol being anti-inflammatory, what you then end up with long-term is this runaway inflammatory load, basically. And that is what's really tied into that chronic fatigue. That's when, if they keep pushing, and then the adrenals can't keep up with that inflammatory load, that's when folks do end up with more what we term chronic fatigue, which I would say is distinct from adrenal fatigue. I'd say it's more at that depleted end of the spectrum where you do end up bedridden, just to make the distinction there.
And when you start to get to the bedridden state, at that point, clinically, you're getting a lot of research coming through that's talking not necessarily to the fact that normally, would you say at that point you've had chronic cortisol to the point where it cracks, and then you have diminished cortisol? And then at that point, the narrative is you can't produce cortisol anymore, which actually isn't the case.
That's right, exactly. What we usually see is when people enter that fight or flight mode where they're just smashing coffee, working around the clock, just thrashing their body, exercising through the roof, their cortisol is going to be high usually. And typically the physiological response of the body, the adaptive response there is to store weight. So often we see people come in, they're like, I don't know why I've put on this XX weight. I'm restricting calories, I'm doing keto, I'm running 3 or 4 times a week. It's like, yeah, your cortisol's through the roof. Your body's under super amounts of stress and it's preserving. That's what we see when the cortisol is high. On the other end of the spectrum, when that starts to burn out and the DHEA, which is another adrenal hormone we'll talk about later on, and cortisol both start to be diminished, that's when usually people start to break down. You see atrophy, you see the immune system crack, you see chronic sore throats and chronic viruses and flus and that sort of thing. And people actually become catabolic and they'll lose flesh, they'll lose muscle unintentionally. So I think it's still important to say that the adrenals are still producing the hormones. It's just that the body's ability to use those two hormones, cortisol and DHEA, become really suboptimal. And then what you have then is this runaway inflammatory process, because those hormones are what's used to counteract that inflammation and come in after your body secreted a massive inflammatory response and go, okay, calm down now, chill out, go back to normal. Mm-hmm. When that can't happen, that's when we start running into autoimmune type presentations. So we have runaway inflammation. It can't be checked. There's not enough cortisol and DHEA present. People are heading more towards that chronic fatigue picture. And that's how I see it play out so often when I do people's case history. There'll be an initial threat. The Epstein-Barr virus is a classic one, which we've talked about a million times before. But sometimes it can be loss of a loved one. It can be loss of a job. It can be a million and one things. But once that light goes off and the body enters that survival mode, if that's not checked and corrected and they keep going and keep going and keep going, unfortunately, sometimes the end result can either be chronic fatigue syndrome, where being bedridden is the consequence, and the mitochondria of the cell, which is the powerhouse of the cell, they shut off as a defense mechanism. We know that now with a lot of the new research, which I think you mentioned earlier, Mace.
Yeah, can you really repeat it just so that everyone can really hit this for my benefit as well?
For sure. Yep. So your cells, every cell in your body has what's called a mitochondria, which actually evolved from bacteria way, way, way back.
Ancestors represent.
Yeah. Right.
Louis Pasteur hated his grandparents, hated his origins.
That's right. Yeah. So these little parts of the cell called mitochondria, right? They evolved from bacteria, but they're essentially the powerhouse of our cell. They're what gives our cell energy. They're what charges up our cells so that we produce ATP, which is energy. What we think with chronic fatigue syndrome and adrenal fatigue type presentations now, which a lot of new research is supporting, is that the body, in reaction to some sort of pathogenic threat, usually retroviruses, is actually turning off the mitochondria of the cell like a stealth protection mechanism so that the virus can't use your nutrients, can't use your B3 and your B2 and all these nutrients that give you energy in your cell. So just to repeat that, a threat comes along, your body, if the threat goes unchecked and sustained,
Give some examples. So Epstein-Barr was an initiator, you said.
Yeah.
Is that also a stealth that remains at this stage?
Exactly. A stealth infection that remains unchecked, that is still grumbling away at a subclinical level. And that can happen for years. That can happen for 5 to 8 years sometimes before people really, really tap out and end up with what's known as chronic fatigue. We're thinking that that's really more so what's happening than the cortisol-centric model, which is what we still do appreciate, but we know that there's more research supporting this concept now of mitochondrial dysfunction. So the cell switching off its mitochondria basically to disable the virus from being able to tap into your nutrients. But unfortunately, in doing so, it puts you into hibernation mode.
Okay, so we've got the distinction there. Adrenal fatigue, we've talked about, heavily lifestyle based. You really are on edge. Like the woman that emailed us yesterday, she's really tired and I'm doing heaps of hot yoga and I'm burning it at both ends and smashing coffee and all that kind of stuff. You're going to see adrenal fatigue. And especially that can be what's going to be a catalyst often is either the fact that you are just working too hard and that you think you have to and that you have the opportunity to bring yourself in check then, or there's something triggers you, whether it's an infection or a loss of a loved one or moving house or whatever it is, a trigger into that stress response. And if that remains unchecked, then you can look down the barrel of going to that place of exhaustion.